Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Jessica Gates, and I'm Senior Vice President of Marketing here at Ipsos. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join our webinar, where we are going to be exploring the power of payer insights tracking in times of turbulence and market disruption. So our session today is being led by two of our top experts, Chris Teal and Alejandro Roland Gomendio. Chris is Senior Vice President with our Market Access team based in the UK, and Alejandro is a Senior Consultant with our UK-based Market Access team. We encourage you to take a moment to also reference the handout section that we've provided in our console here, where you can take a look at Ipsos's expertise, both within markets access, but more specifically within payer insights, which is of course related to our discussion today. So today's presentation is going to run for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to use the balance of our time together to address your questions live. So we do highly encourage, very much welcome your questions. To ask a question, simply use the questions function in the console in front of you, where you will submit the question privately to our team. Should you have any technical issues during this session, you can just simply also click on the questions and chat your request to our support team. Finally, I'd like to mention that our session is being recorded and will be sent to you via email in case you wish to revisit the material, or certainly we encourage you to share it with colleagues. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Chris, and he is going to help get us started in thinking about the power of payer insights tracking. Chris.
Thank you, Jess, and welcome everybody. And I hope you're all safe in these times of turbulence and market disruption. And our webinar today is entitled The Power of Payer Insights Tracking. And I start by saying that Ipsos has identified a series of payer game changers. These are the sum of the biggest areas of turbulence and market disruption that a company can face. Now, obviously, COVID-19 is one of the current examples, but there are others. And we're asking ourselves, how do these create particular challenges for payers? And in these areas, do we understand how payers' perceptions, requirements, and behaviors are changing over time? And how quickly, and what is driving them? So in the next 30 minutes, you will learn the 6 biggest payer challenges for the future that we have identified. We'll pass some comments on what is lacking with current approaches. We'll introduce you to the smart approach, a smart approach to payer insights tracking. And we'll also explore the high-level R&D and commercial decisions that these insights can feed into. We'll discuss the types of payers we talk to and the parameters that can be tracked. And we'll complete the webinar with a couple of examples from these areas of turbulence and market disruption. So, as you're probably all aware, currently, tracking within the industry is most often focused on healthcare professionals and disease management. The most famous, of course, are the ATUs, the awareness, trial, and usage studies, which capture high-level overviews of a market at a point in time, provide foundational marketing information that's essential to strategic management of a brand, and they're conducted on a repeating schedule so that changes can be monitored over time, focusing on brand awareness, trial, and usage of the brand. Now, ATUs are extremely powerful, impactful, and are becoming increasingly sophisticated. However, in situations of turbulence and market disruption, payer insights tracking is critical for market understanding and commercial success. So, what are these areas that I'm talking about, these areas of turbulence and market disruption? Well, we at Ipsos Research have identified 6 key areas. And just for your information, or if you're wondering why they're in different colors here, the 2 in orange are actually going to be the sources of the examples we will give later in this webinar. So the 6 areas are, for example, where you have a loss of exclusivity coinciding with the arrival of new innovation. Now, we've seen that with the biosimilarization of the anti-TNFs and the arrival of new innovation in the form of the JAK inhibitors and the interleukin. In this world, we have there, where for the payer perspective, that's an opportunity for budget savings, but there's also a risk of price contagion for the new innovation. The next area we identified is affordability, and this is most often seen, increasingly seen in oncology, where you get combinations of high cost, high value, targeted and immunotherapies that when you add them together, create huge affordability problems for the payer. The next area we identified related to emerging disease areas. These are the ones like NASH and Alzheimer's disease, where there are hidden costs today, but no therapeutic options, no effective therapeutic options. And so, of course, with the arrival of new therapies that are effective in this area, there is potential for huge budget impact tomorrow. We're seeing the turbulence caused by digital therapeutics. These technological developments in connected health, like wearables, apps, and even algorithms that do not fit the current episodic payment models for healthcare. We're seeing the increased dominance of genomics, of the use of biomarkers. Now that's an opportunity to increase clinical and economic predictability being something that payers particularly value of a therapy, but at the additional cost of biomarker testing. And finally, there are those new treatments with what we call a high price density. These are expensive single-use therapies with uncertain durations of effect, requiring innovative success, access, and payment solutions. The example here that spring to mind are the gene therapies and things like the CAR-Ts. So they're the 6 areas that we've identified. And in these areas, the payer can be a significant barrier to market access and product uptake. So we'd look out and track triggers that cause payer perceptions and behaviors to change as they struggle to rationally allocate their limited resources in the face of rapidly growing healthcare demand. And I think we're going to see in a post-COVID environment even greater limitations around resources with the economic impact hitting the world. So typically that we see trigger 1, and I summarize that as the availability of choice. This is where the payer now has choice. Coming through the loss of exclusivity, the arrival of generics and biosimilars, and the arrival of new innovation. Trigger 2 could be the arrival of new decision influencers. For example, the first disease-modifying therapy in an area of unmet need. The one we're going to see this year, of course, is in NASH. Changes in healthcare policy or new types of data. As you're aware, increasingly health technology assessment systems are now starting to embrace forms of real-world evidence that only 1 year ago, 2 years ago, they would not do so. And of course, then there are trigger 3, the after effects of systemic shocks, for example, COVID-19. So identifying the triggers and tracking the evolving payer behaviors and requirements is critical for marketing understanding and commercial success. But, clearly all of this isn't new. What is lacking with current approaches? Well, current approaches tend to focus on a single point in time. They do not measure change, or probably equally importantly, rate of change over time. And often they're not smart. They do not build in the learnings from the past. They do not necessarily look to the future and do not necessarily measure the effectiveness of previous actions. So the approach that we are using and increasingly with our clients is addresses both the past, the present, and the future. The establishment of a baseline, essentially incorporating learnings from the past, and then also establishing the present cross-sectional data. Monitoring evolution over time, generation of longitudinal data, remeasuring the same parameters, and at the same time anticipating the future beyond the period that we're actually monitoring at any one time. And then provision of advisory and consultancy support, so the analysis and interpretation of these insights and a clear set of actionable recommendations. And it's key to stress that in all of this, the approach to payer insight tracking we use is aligned to the client's commercial strategy. So the commercial strategy is translated into the various KPIs we measure during the process. We go through all along this bar of activities, which I won't go through in detail in this webinar, get to the end, and then of course, based on what you've seen, you get a feedback loop challenging the organization's commercial strategy or its brand strategy from a payer perspective. It particularly can be particularly impactful in influencing the evolution of the commercial strategy. And as I said at the end, we do insights and data alone are interesting, but lack power without the provision of advisory and consultancy services to provide analysis and expert support in the interpretation of these payer insights. So as I stress again, essentially 5 areas: learning from the past, the use of analog analyses, where it's relevant, the comparison to ATU insights that the marketing teams will be receiving, analyzing change and impact and measuring effectiveness of your previous actions, anticipating the future, horizon scanning, and tracking how your horizon vision is changing over time, or the payer's horizon vision is changing over time, and identifying the options and making the recommendations. So all very interesting, but what decisions do these insights feed into? And I put 5 of them on this slide. They can feed and should increasingly feed earlier on into the commercial life cycle, if you like. They should feed into the R&D strategy, into project go, no-go decisions, into resource allocation decisions within R&D, and into indication order sequencing decisions in terms of R&D, of development planning. They should feed into the commercial and brand strategy, into the forecasting, the marketing resource allocation, and into the messaging. They should be feeding into the payer evidence development strategy. Since it is insights, they are insights coming directly from the payers, into the health economics outcomes research strategy, the real world evidence strategy, and into modeling. And then below the line, feeding into the market access strategy, the pricing strategy, the value story, the value communication, the launch order sequencing, and into payer negotiation. And finally, potentially great impact and value in feeding into government affairs, advocacy, and investor relations, where there's a clear need for policy focus and activity planning. So what sort of payers can be tracked? And basically we sort of block these into 4 areas. The national healthcare system payers, these are the technology evaluating, access controlling, budget holding type payers at the pan-national, national, regional, and local levels, although local is increasingly challenging in these times of COVID-19. They're what I call alternative payers. They may be the private insurers or even the patient as the payer. The high-level influencers, the policymakers, which we also define to an extent as payers, and also the purchasers, the procurers, the tendering and contracting and procurement organizations, the buying organizations. What parameters can be tracked? And again, similar sort of approach. You can track the payer perception of pharmaceutical companies, of their capabilities, of their reputation, of their reliability. You can track the payer perception of product propositions, the perceptions of value. And by product propositions, I don't just mean the product. You may be offering a product plus value-added services. You might be offering a product plus an innovative delivery device. So it's the perceptions of value, the clinical, economic, and humanistic value. And you can track the willingness to pay for these product plus propositions. You can also track payer perceptions and value of pricing propositions, moving away from the single concept of price per month to manage entry agreements, innovative contracting, financial risk mitigation, and outcomes-based reimbursement. Other parameters that might be tracked relate to payer evidence, the payer's requirements, the relevance of the evidence, the robustness, the acceptability, and the impact. And also tracking payers around their views on their payer communications in terms of the information they receive and the extent to which it offers an education and develops their understanding of a disease area. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alejandro, who's going to take you through the very first example before returning to me. Alejandro?
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris mentioned earlier, there's many potential areas of turbulence and market disruption. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to take you through an example of payer insights tracking, which tackles the area of affordability specifically, particularly tracking payer perceptions of company reputation in therapy areas with affordability challenges due to a combination of high value, high cost products. So the situation in these types of therapy area is typically a rapidly evolving landscape with multiple companies introducing increasingly innovative products, which will significantly impact payer budgets. Trends towards using combinations of two or more high-value, high-cost products further impacts payer affordability in this space. At the national level, solutions are typically being negotiated to achieve reimbursement or coverage at an acceptable list price. However, implementation at the subnational level is typically problematic. Payer perception on the products can be tracked via typical market research. This is, for example, IDIs, interviews, ad boards, focus groups, etc. However, at the subnational level, the relationship payers have with companies and the perception they have of these companies can also affect the potential access of these products. Therefore, the approach is designed to identify changes in subnational payer attitudes and perceptions towards the leading companies in this therapy area to improve these relationships and how the company is perceived by these payers. So who are these subnational payers we're talking about? These are regional or local budget holders responsible for the acquisition and management of medicines in this respective therapy area. And really, it's key that they've had multiple interactions with at least 50% of the leading companies in the therapy area, especially in the last year, in order to ensure that we track the current perception of these companies and really accurately measure how these evolve over time. So what did we track? Really, we focused on these 5 key areas. First one being innovation. So who do payers think is leading the race in the therapy area and really who's lagging behind? So the KPIs here relate to the perceived characteristics of each company's portfolio and the company as a whole. Then we move on to trust. So are the companies trusted and really what are the drivers behind this and the payer perception of the companies? Payer negotiation capabilities. So how are the companies negotiating access for the products? Really, is it well perceived by each payer type? And really, this is really a key point to stay informed on how the negotiation strategy is being perceived by the payers and how this could affect the access. Then we have engagement. So are the engagement payers have with the different companies to the liking, what is each company doing, and really how are the payers reacting to each of the engagement strategies for each of the companies. And finally, we have company reputation. So just to sum everything up, what's the company image, really what drives this, and how are the payers really perceiving each of the companies in the market. So how do we carry this out? Essentially, it could be divided into 4 phases. First off, we obviously start with the tracker design. So the key for a successful tracker really is to first hold this workshop to brainstorm on KPIs and align these with the company's commercial strategy. We need to ensure that these KPIs will be actionable and relevant and really need to nail down which KPIs are necessary in order not to dilute the tracker and really kind of focus it down. The KPIs are then validated through a series of IDIs with payers in each of the scope countries in order to ensure that they're relevant to the targeted profiles. And after this, the survey is generated and another wave of pilot IDIs is carried out with payers in order to test the survey design in itself. After this, we move to the baseline wave. So the survey is validated. So after it's validated, we launch this baseline wave and collect the first set of data, which we analyze and generate insights on the current landscapes. Recommendations on actionable insights are also included, and all of this essentially will conclude what we are calling the baseline wave. After this, at regular or event-driven frequencies, we collect the data for wave 1 and subsequent waves, and in these, additional KPIs can also be added if deemed necessary. And finally, for each wave's data, Ipsos analyzes the KPI evolution and trends and provides country-specific recommendations and actionable insights based on these, as well as contrasting them to any HCP insights in order to accurately represent the landscape. So this interpretation is carried out based on trends and Ipsos experience and expertise in the therapy area. So what are the types of actionable insights and recommendations that do come out of this tracker? So here's some examples. First off, insights on the relative importance of payer decision drivers. So what is really driving these payers to cover one product over another? Is it purely just the product's value drivers in TPP, or how are the different negotiations affecting this? We also have insights on differing perceptions of payers and HCP, and not only how this can affect potential access, but how can HCP perception potentially influence payer perception. areas of value to payers or non-value as well that the company should prioritize or deprioritize. In relation to the company's engagement strategy, how can this be improved and tailored to each payer profile? There's also areas where payer education is lacking, so this usually links very nicely when comparing insights to HCP data, especially in the perception of innovation. And finally, we have insights on time to impact of policy and expected actions from pharmaceutical companies. So now Chris will talk you through another example of how payer insights tracking can be put into practice. I'll give it back to you, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Alejandro. And yes, the example I'm going to give as my second example relates to inflammatory disease. You recall earlier in this webinar, we talked about the perfect storm, where you get the loss of exclusivity, in this example case, the biosimilarization of the anti-TNFs, with the almost simultaneous arrival of new innovation like the JAK inhibitors and the interleukins. And the situation we faced was that the company that we were working with had a portfolio of products in the inflammatory disease space. They had products in the TNF space. In fact, they might even have had a whole portfolio of TNFs of a biosimilar nature. In addition, they were launching and had either JAK inhibitors or interleukins in their portfolio. And the challenge facing the company was, how do you maximize the net present value of their future biologic revenues? And this is going to be done in a world with two opposing pricing dynamics: the downward pricing pressure of the biosimilars and the upward pricing aspirations of these new innovators, these new innovations. Now, as you'll recall, it's fairly obvious that the net present value of revenue will depend on essentially five things. It depends on your product proposition, what the product is, in fact, what you're offering. That could include value-added services. It includes your pricing proposition, your level of access and reimbursement, your position in the clinical therapy, and also your position within the formulary, and your volume uptake. So it's fairly obvious, and the client very clearly specified, notice this, that success will depend on understanding how within this sort of area, payer perceptions and their behaviors are changing, where payer focus is moving, and how payer decision drivers are changing. So that was basically the sort of situation and the challenge. And I'm going to show you here just basically the framework we created of the factors in just one element of the tracker. It was a huge tracker. And this is the rheumatoid arthritis element. So we looked at essentially across sort of 5 dimensions that are listed down the left-hand side of this slide: the product, the type of differentiation, the company archetype, the purchasing or procurement system they were in, and the decision criteria on which purchasing and prescribing and dispensing positions were taken. And the types of products we looked at within the tracker were the original TNFs, the biooriginals, the biosimilar TNFs, and also the new innovation, the JAK inhibitor. For differentiation, we looked at payer perceptions around product proposition differentiation, pricing proposition differentiation, and the relative value between these different propositions. And again, it's quite interesting in this research with the tracker that, of course, a biosimilar product is by definition similar to the original product. But of course, the value of your product lies in your level of differentiation. So you've got to introduce other forms of differentiation besides product differentiation. The company archetype, as I say, the particular piece of work we're describing here, the company was a portfolio player. It had lots of cards in its hand. The company was particularly interested in all the different procurement systems between classical supply chain, retail pharmacy. They were also particularly interested in the tender and contract environment, the procurement environment, that is. And when it came down to decision criteria, clearly there's a mixture between decisions based on clinical parameters or economic parameters. And when you sort of turn around, you suddenly see that clinical economic parameters can be split up into a monocriteria decision making, decisions made on the basis of lowest net price, or multi-criteria decision making, where lowest net price is also trade off with other non-price criteria. And clearly the client was particularly interested in ensuring that we didn't move to trying to avoid situations where you have mono criteria decision making, because lowest net price will always lead to into a pricing spiral, and of course a non-stable market. So what sort of key questions and key payers do we talk to? Key questions related to the differential characteristics of the product or service offered, the willingness to pay of the willingness of the payer to pay for these differences. And I must be totally transparent here. The first question that comes up is, can you actually have net price transparency? And the answer is no, because clearly there are issues of confidentiality around the net prices you are charging. But what you can do is you can have transparency across price indices and look at the changing relative to where you were in the past, even if you're not totally uncertain where you were in the past. Asking questions around how impactful or valuable is a portfolio approach? What factors drive the procurement or the reimbursement decision? What is the relative importance of those factors? What is the role and relevance of evidence, whether it be randomized control, real world evidence, or modeling? How have these evolved, which is the subject of the tracker as you go through the various waves, and the question around how will they evolve in the future, which is the value added of the Ipsos point of view. For payers we talk to, strictly defined criteria used to select the respondents for inclusion in the panel, and I must stress that when we do that, we are fully at all stages, we ensure full compliance with the client's standard operating procedures on healthcare professional and payer interactions. The other thing I'd just like to add on this slide is that clearly in these sort of things, when you interview and talk to a payer, sometimes there's an evidence-based hard answer to a question, but we also allow for soft opinion-based responses. So you can always associate a level of confidence that can be associated with payer responses. And my final slide on this particular example is just taken out of the research of this particular payer insight tracker, and it shows the differences between the anti-TNF originator and biosimilar side of the tracker and the new innovation side of the tracker. On the anti-TNF side, clearly we were seeing a decrease in the net prices due to a combination of increased competition, but also as a result of policies and new regulations to encourage use of better value products. We saw the increase in the use of incentives as a desire for payers to ensure use of best value options. And it's quite interesting, the research and the tracker clearly identified the concept of best value as opposed to cheapest. They're not necessarily the same thing. And the tracker also demonstrated from a payer perspective views on the attempts of TNF manufacturers to differentiate. The payer's willingness to pay and how the payer's willingness to pay for this varies between payer types and the nature of the differentiation. On the right-hand side of the tracker, the new innovation, the JAK inhibitors and the interleukins, we were starting to see, although there was, at the list price level, there is clear acceptance of the incremental value relative to the TNFs, we were definitely seeing net price contagion of new innovation by the TNFs, of the new innovation. And we did publish something on at ISPOR last year on our insights in that area. We definitely tracked the increased use, acceptability, and most importantly, influence of real-world data. And particularly in this case of the JAK inhibitors, we saw increased payer focus on safety, the importance of the identification of the population with greatest benefit, the position in therapy, and treatment sequencing. Putting the two together, we have that it was very clear, and we track this sort of observation over time, that payers are increasingly interested in the cost and value along the whole treatment pathway, rather than just a product in isolation. the costs and consequences of different treatment strategies in different subpopulations. And there was a genuine and increasing interest in portfolio solutions, because clearly it allows some sort of modulation within the portfolio, while at the same time delivering better value to the payers. So finally, as we approach the end of the webinar, looking ahead, and I mentioned earlier in this webinar the after effects of systemic shocks. And so, tracking the short and longer term impacts of COVID-19 on payers and market access. So I think we're all aware that following, once we're out of the COVID period, the future of healthcare funding will face major disruption and reprioritization. As you know, healthcare budgets tend to be a function of gross domestic product. If gross domestic product has a hit, then you're going to get an impact there on the size of the healthcare budget. I think it's fair to say through everything that we've seen, we'll see more and more unstructured data sources around us. I think it's probably quite important to ask the questions: what will the impact on the payer? What will the impact of these systemic shocks on their priorities, on their processes, on healthcare policy, on pricing, and probably most importantly, given the economic impact, on affordability? I think at this stage, that's as far as we wanted to go, and I hand over back to Jess now to moderate any questions that you've passed in during the webinar. Thank you very much for your time and interest.
Well, thank you, Chris and Alejandro, for the most excellent content today. So we are going to open up for a discussion to answer your questions. If we do not get to your questions live today, we certainly commit to following up with you directly one-on-one following the session. So please use the questions function in the control panel to submit questions. The first question we have is, you talk about the impact of COVID-19 on payer and market access. Could you be a bit more concrete in your thinking in this area?
I think I can take that one, Jess. I'd say, well, yeah, of course we can. And let's be honest, well, nobody really knows what the overall impact it will have on the payers. I think that's very clear. But already we are seeing an impact on timelines, on HTA consultations with, I suppose, recent announcements by the GBR in Germany and NICE in England. In the medium term, I suppose, the shock may force changes in the funding models in certain areas of healthcare. I suppose the longer term, as I mentioned, the economic shock and consequent reduced gross domestic products, I suppose, may trigger a reduction in budgets in some areas, but I think you'll also see increase in healthcare resources, probably in the vaccine space, in areas due to reprioritization. I'm sure every payer will have a view on what it will mean for the future, and I suppose those views will evolve as some form of normality returns. I know, here within Ipsos, we are considering offering a horizon scanning system to monitor this evolution based on regular primary data capture from payers, but also reinforced by secondary sources and sort of expert interpretation, structured by theme, sort of policy, what else were there, priorities, budgets, timelines, etc., evidence requirements, capturing in insights and opinions from a community of payers that we're setting up. So if anybody does have an interest in this, well, please email me us and we'll get back to you. I think that's really all I can add at this stage, Jess.
Okay. Not surprisingly, the next question is also COVID related. How feasible is tracking these payer profiles during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yep, so I'll be happy to take that one, Jess. Essentially, basically in certain therapy areas, obviously it's going to be quite challenging, especially, for example, in internal medicine, respiratory and infectious diseases. But really in the remaining therapy areas, we're seeing payers that actually do have more time. We're sensitive to the fact that local payers, for example, these hospital pharmacists, especially, they're providing kind of key advisory services in a time of increased demand, and we don't want to distract them from their increased workload. Even though payers are occupied with the pandemic, they're really not typically as overburdened as their counterparts, as their HCPs, and really do appear to still be willing to participate in the trackers. This really is especially true for regional and local and national payers. However, the situation is evolving rapidly, so this may not be true a couple of weeks down the line. Really, every step of the way, we're being sensitive to the payers' priorities, and we're taking a lead from them in terms of their ability and interest in sharing insights with us in these trackers.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro. The next question is, in these trackers, who is the owner of the data? Do clients also get access to the raw data or just a report?
Sure, so I can take this one as well, since it's a bit more logistic related. But essentially, the data is always the property of the client, and they have the full rights to it. So data protection regulations are respected at all times and really appropriately blinded. We typically host the data on our own dashboards for ease of viewing and comparison between waves. We typically design these dashboards ourselves to kind of adhere to the different KPIs and to really be specific to that tracker. However, the client can download the raw CSVs and host the data wherever they please. The dashboards are fully customizable for each project in order to best reflect the KPIs and evolution. So we do recommend hosting them there. But at the end of the day, the data really is property of the client, and they can do whatever they want with it.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is, how valuable do you see payer tracking in combination with HCP patient tracking versus tracking payers in isolation? So basically, can you go a bit further on the link between payer trackers and ATUs?
Probably I can pick that one up, Jess, because it's been a great learning journey for me as we've been developing the payer insight tracking processes and systems, that I've been talking increasingly to our colleagues within Ipsos that to lead the ATU trackers. And as I mentioned earlier, the ATUs are becoming increasingly sophisticated and dynamic. You know, they can be reinforced and are being reinforced by secondary and syndicated data. Where they are linked with promotional spend, for example, and marketing mix optimization, you start to really get smart ATUs that track more closely physician response to stimulus. So I suppose at the end of the day, thinking about it, that revenues are really driven by three stakeholders: by the healthcare professionals, by the payers, and also by the patients. So it makes sense to link, in certain situations, of course, not all, in an intelligent way, I suppose, the tracking of all three, if that makes sense.
Okay. The next question is, you mentioned the value of payer tracking early in the R&D pipeline. Why should this be done?
Well, I can probably finish on this one, Jess. As I mentioned briefly earlier in the webinar, baking the payer into R&D is increasingly important. Increasingly important. Without it, there is a tendency to win regulatory approval, but fail to understand and develop the evidence required for a product to become commercially successful. So you jump the regulatory hurdle, but you fail and fall flat on your face at the payer hurdle. In addition, early insight from payers can also help to inform prioritization of assets and help companies think about their future sort of commercialization potential. I think I can probably end by just saying that our experience indicates that it's not the cost of undertaking payer insight tracking that is important. It's far higher. The cost of not doing it is actually far higher. So yeah, I think that's probably it. Do we have any more questions, Jess? Or?
No, that's it. So with that, we are now actually going to conclude the session. So thanks again, of course, Alejandro and Chris, for the great content. And thank you very much to our audience for sharing part of your day with us. We hope you found the session to be valuable in your planning. As mentioned, of course, a recording will be shared with you shortly via email directly from our team. We do encourage you to take a look at the handout section. Again, we have some information on our market access abilities, as well as our particular expertise in payer tracking. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to personally speak with you about your payer strategies. So certainly you can reach out to Chris and Alejandro here, or any of your local Ipsos contacts directly. So thanks so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.